Thank you. You may be seated.
All right. All right, go ahead and turn in your Bibles this morning to Ephesians chapter 6, where we find the Apostle Paul giving us a warning. So Ephesians chapter 6, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 4. I, again, want to wish our fathers a happy Father's Day. Again, this is your special day. And I don't know if you know how Father's Day came about. It was observed a little over 100 years ago. There was a young lady came to a sermon about mothers. And during the message, she began thinking about her father. And her father was a Civil War veteran. Sonora's mother had died early in life, so her father was a single parent raising Sonora and her 6 siblings. But she thought it would be a wonderful tribute to have a special time to honor her father and all fathers. And so it was the month of June, and she asked her church to take time, and they honored fathers for the first time on the 3rd Sunday of June in 1910. Well, the tradition caught on. President Woodrow Wilson tried to make Father's Day a holiday, but Congress resisted, and so it was defeated. And then in 1966, President Lyndon Johnson finally issued the first presidential proclamation honoring fathers. But it wasn't until 6 years later that the day was made a permanent national holiday when President Richard Nixon signed it into law in 1972. And so again, we dads get a holiday. And what a tremendous responsibility that our fathers have. Sean, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and get ready with that video. What a responsibility that we as fathers have. You have a responsibility to protect your family. I heard the story of a wife who for many years couldn't sleep at night because she was so worried that her home would be burglarized. And often in the middle of the night, she would hear noises and then awaken her husband out of a sound sleep and would make him go and investigate. And this went on for years. Well, one night, she heard a noise in the house and woke up her husband. Honey, someone is really downstairs. You've got to get up. And so groggily, he gets up and goes downstairs to investigate. And when he gets there, he finds a burglar who had actually broken in. The husband is now wide awake and said to the burglar, "Please, you have to come upstairs and meet my wife. She has been waiting 10 years to meet you." But you fathers have a tremendous responsibility to protect families, the children, an untiring work and unselfish giving to provide for them. And so this morning, I wanted to just show this tribute to our fathers. It only will take a few minutes, and then we'll get started with the message, all right? So go ahead and play that for us.
Hey kids, Mom needs more help inside.
Hey, how many kids do you have?
3.
3?
Yeah.
That is a good number.
Whoa. Let's just concentrate on this one for now. Hey, what's it like being a dad?
I would love 1 hour with you, 1 hour of just being with you. Then I could say,
Kiss her, Daddy, kiss her.
Hashtag gag me.
Ugh.
Mr. Clams has been sleeping for 2 days, Daddy. Goodbye, Mr. Clams.
No! All right, just slow down a little
Dad,
bit.
stop yelling at me.
I don't think that... Oh, okay. All right, and that is why we always wear our seatbelt. And that's the birds and the bees. Yeah. I am so proud of you, son.
Run.
Huh?
Run, it's gonna blow!
Have I told you lately?
I know, Dad. You love me. You tell me all the time.
Actually, I was going to tell you I think you're beautiful inside and out.
Whatever. Dad, you are disgusting.
Yeah, Dad, you are disgusting.
This right here goes to your future, this right here goes to you, and this right here goes to God.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. How much does God get?
What's wrong, beautiful?
Trevor broke up with me.
Thank you, Lord.
He's such a jerk. He broke up with me on a text message.
He just replied.
Dad, I can't believe you. Thanks, Dad.
He didn't deserve you. He didn't deserve you. 1, 2, 3. Heavenly Father, thank you for being so good to us.
God has the coolest job. He can make clouds all day.
Yeah, he does. But I think one of his very best jobs is when he made you.
Daddy.
Hey, what's it like being a dad?
How much time you got?
Now, I know that sometimes we dads aren't dialed in like we ought to be. We make mistakes and say and do the wrong things, especially when it comes to our kids. I heard this story of a mother who left her baby daughter in her husband's care while she was busy doing some work in another room. Well, Dad immediately buried himself in his newspaper and forgot all about the baby until he heard a series of thumps, followed by this horrendous cry. And instantly he knew that the baby had fallen down the stairs. So he called out to his wife and he said, "Honey, come quick. Our little girl just took her first 14 steps." So we fathers are not perfect, but I believe that in the heart of every dad in this room, in the heart of every guy in this room who one day wants to be a dad. You do not want to be a so-so dad. You want to be a great dad, a dad after God's own heart. You want to do a great job for your kids. So how does that happen? Well, this morning in Ephesians 6, the Apostle Paul gives us some things on how to be a good dad. And he gives us some things that we should do, and also a very significant warning that if we don't listen to, we could very well turn the children that we love away from us. So let's read our text, Ephesians chapter 6. And now, these two chapters, Ephesians 5 and 6, in these two chapters, the Apostle Paul talks a lot about the family. In chapter 5, and he begins in verse 21, and he gives 4 verses on how wives are to honor and respect their husbands. And then, in the next 9 verses, in chapter 5, he talks about how husbands are to love their wives. I think he knew that we needed a little bit more help on that one. But he tells us to love our wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself. He told us as husbands to love our wives sacrificially. Then in chapter 6, and these are the verses that we're going to look at here, he begins chapter 6, and he gives 3 verses to the children on how they are to obey their parents. And he talks about their relationship, and then he just gives 1 verse on fathers and how they're to treat the children. Again, I said all that. Listen to this. 9 verses on how husbands are to love their wives. 4 verses on how a wife is to respect her husband. 3 verses on how kids are to obey their parents. And then just 1 verse on how fathers are to treat their children. I think he gave us 1 verse so that we would not forget. He wanted to make it very simple. So let's read our text here, beginning in verse number 1, Ephesians 6. Children, say it with me, obey your what? Obey your parents. What a responsibility that you have. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And I'll say this to our young people who are here this morning. If you want to do God's will, that's it right there. That's the commandment that he has given to you. And he says, I want you to know that there is a fringe benefit for honoring your father and your mother. I have a promise to give to you. Let's say verse number 3 together. That it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. That's a promise that he gives to you if you'll honor your father and your mother. Now he comes to verse number 4. Oh my. Verse number 4. Every father in this room, I'm going to ask you, if you have not memorized this verse, I want you to begin this week to put it in your heart. Let's say it together. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Let's repeat it again. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Paul begins by giving a significant warning to us as fathers. Now, he knew that we needed to be aware of this particular truth. He addresses it specifically to dads because dads have a difficult time with this. But he says, number one, parents or fathers, you can cause your children to become angry and discouraged. He says, I don't want you to provoke or stir your children up to wrath. We can actually parent our children in such a way that we can actually push them away from us and make our children bitter. Paul is saying if you are not careful, you have the potential to produce angry, emotionally unstable, unhealthy children that these problems and anger can well carry into their adult life. And we see that all the time. When Paul uses the word provoke, it means to enrage. It means to exasperate. You say, what in the world does that mean? It means to rile up or to arouse feelings of anger that range from impatience to rage. Not only can we cause them to become angry and bitter, but I also said that we can cause them to become discouraged or to lose hope. Colossians chapter 3, this is the second verse. These two verses is what I'm preaching on this morning. This is, again, another verse that every father, every grandfather ought to hide in their heart. Colossians 3:21 says this, Fathers, provoke not your children to anger. Just a mirror verse of Ephesians chapter of the verses we just looked at. But it adds this, Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest, and the result of that is what? Lest they be discouraged, or it leads to discouragement. Did you know this, that as a parent, you can beat your children down so much that they actually lose hope to the place where they don't care anymore, and to the place where they don't even want to try to please you anymore? You can beat them down. This morning, I would like to suggest a number of ways that we as parents may, listen to this, unjustly provoke our children to anger and to discouragement to where they lose hope. Number two, we can provoke our children to anger by physically or verbally abusing our children. You know, if we do this, you're going to provoke them to anger, and they're going to be bitter, and they're not going to be healthy. They're going to be angry kids, resentful kids, and I think with most of us that goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Don't physically abuse your kids. Our children need loving discipline, but there are parents who in anger haul off and smack their children just because they're bigger than they are. We ought to never physically abuse them. Now, most of us know that we're not supposed to do that, but how about the verbal abuse? There are lots of parents, Christian parents, who verbally abuse their kids. And it's one of those things that can come easily out of us because we're human beings as dad, as parents. And so we can get stressed and we can get angry and we can fly off the handle. And when they do something, man, it can just be a barrage of words that come out. You know, one of the things that I learned, and I kind of learned it a little bit later than I wish I had, but for all you dads, young dads especially, remember this: you are a Superman to your kids. And you're a superhero. And they're looking up to you. Nobody is as tough as dad. Nobody is as strong as dad. Nobody can do what dad can do. And that's how a little child sees his dad or her dad. And so when you're a Superman to your kid, you have a lot of power in that child's life with the things that you say. And so the Bible says in the book of Proverbs, listen to this, death and life are in the power of your tongue. You can say things that can cause death, that can cause discouragement, and you can say things that will destroy your child, or you have the power with your tongue to lift them up, to encourage them, to edify them. Death and life are in the power of your tongue. You can use words to speak words of life to your children, and that's what the Bible says. He says to every single father in here and to every single mother, let no corrupt or unwholesome communication proceed out of your mouth. Our children ought not to ever hear unwholesome words, but they ought to hear what? You say it with me, that's underlined. But that which is good to the use of edifying, to build them up, to encourage them, that it may minister grace, mercy unto those children, unto the hearers. Oh, that's so powerful. That is so powerful. We ought to build up our children, not tear them down. It's critical to remember this. We have to watch the things that come from out of our mouth. I was at Giant Eagle just yesterday, and man, we got a refrigerator finally, and I didn't want to go grocery shopping, but I did. And I was walking into the store, and I met a fella that I know, and he's a policeman. And we were just walking into the store together, and he said, "Pray for me." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I am so angry. I am so angry." I said, "What are you angry about?" And we talked a little bit, and God bless our police officers who have to deal with every kind of scumbag out there. You understand what I'm saying? The crime and the violence. I heard on the news that, well, I don't need to go there. It's discouraging. But he said, "I'm just so angry at them," and we talked for a little bit. We can become so angry. A friend told me when he was a kid, he's about my age now, 39, and he told me, he said when, I said that because I have a birthday coming up, all right? That's not true. I'm 40. All right, when I was a kid, my dad told me this. He said, "Son, you're so stupid. You couldn't pour out water from a boot if the instructions were written on the heel of it." Now that's a pretty vivid expression. And that boy remembered what his dad said 40 years later. How many of you would raise your hand and say, "I remember certain things 30, 40 years ago that my mom or dad said to me"? You can raise your hand, and most of you can. It hurts. You know, we have that old expression, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Baloney. That's a lie. Words hurt. And when words come from a super dad to a child that says, "You're no good, I wish I had never had you, you'll never amount to anything, you're a loser, you're a mess up," those kind of things that can come out of anger, and that wounds a kid and it really messes them up. Watch out for those things. In Vacation Bible School, I had child after child. I asked them, how is it back home? "Oh, my mom and dad, all they do is yell and scream at each other." Yelling and screaming only teaches them. And if you yell at them, you know what you're actually teaching them? You're teaching them that it's okay to yell and scream. You're teaching it's the right response. You're actually teaching them to respond in anger. Watch out for that verbal abuse. That's not the way to go. Our children need affirmation and praise rather than criticism. Sometimes we can critique them to where they become discouraged. Now, we need to be parents, and I understand that, but they need more affirmation and praise. Before my wife died, there were certain things that she told me. And months before she went to heaven, she would sit me down and say, "Kim, I need you to promise me certain things." And I said, "Well, anything, honey." She said, "You promise me. You praise the children more than you criticize them. Will you do that for me?" There wasn't, in those months, a week that went by where she would ask me to promise, "Please, will you praise the children more than you criticize them? Will you look for ways to say yes more than no? Will you do that? Will you promise to do that?" That's been a challenge for me. Words of affirmation are so important. It can change their life forever. I was doing some painting. We, again, moved into our house, and I was working on the house, and there was a movie on the television. It was Rocky II. How many of you guys like Rocky? Some of you can't stand it, right? Well, anyway, I was listening to Rocky II, and Rocky Balboa, and yeah, man, you know, he talks like that, and who talks like that? Anyway, I was watching a clip, and Rocky's fighting Apollo Creed for the second time. And he goes through round one, and Apollo is just tagging Rocky like crazy. And he comes back, he's sitting on the bench, and he's like all defeated. And Mick, his trainer, says, and he tells Mick, his trainer, he says, I think he broke my nose again. And so he's getting ready to go back out for round two, and he says this. Rocky says, that guy's just great, man. And Mickey says to him, nah, he's just a man. Rocky, you're a tank. You're a greasy, fast, 200-pound Italian tank. Go through him. Run over him. And Rocky says, I'm a tank. I'm a 200-pound Italian tank. And he went through, and he ran out there, and he won the fight. He ran over him. And I was listening. I had the paintbrush in my hand. And I go, Rocky, go, man. Run over him. I love that because he started to believe the truth instead of becoming defeated. And when you affirm your kids, you're actually encouraging them. You're building them up. Man, you can do anything. I'm proud of you. You can do this. I know that you can. That kid gets up and says, man, I can do this. And he goes out and tackles the world. John Trent, in one of his books, tells the story of how a woman who grabbed his arm at a conference after he spoke on the enormous need we have for affirmation to our children. And she said, Dr. Trent, may I tell you my story? Actually, it's a story of something my son did with my granddaughter. My son has two daughters, one who's 5 and one who is 2. For several years, my son would take the oldest girl out and spend time with her, but he had never taken the 2-year-old out until recently. Well, on their first date, when the younger one, the 2-year-old, he took her out to breakfast. They'd just gotten a big stack of pancakes when she said, my son decided it would be a good time to tell his child, this little girl, how much he loved and appreciated her. Jenny, he said, I want you to know how much I love you and how special you are to Mom and me. We prayed for you for years, and now that you're here and growing up to be such a wonderful girl, we couldn't be more proud of you. Once he had said all of this, he stopped talking and reached over with his fork to begin eating, but he never got the fork to go to his mouth. His daughter, the little 2-year-old, reached out her little hand and laid it on her father's hand. And his eyes went to hers, and in a soft, pleading voice, she said, longer, Daddy, longer. He put his fork down and proceeded to tell her some more reasons and ways that he loved her and appreciated her. And then he again reached for his fork, and a second time, and a third, and a fourth time. And each time he heard the words, longer, Daddy, longer. Father didn't even get to eat his breakfast, but the little girl got what she so much needed. Our kids need physical and verbal affection and affirmation. Our children seldom hear words of commendation and encouragement when they do a job well or exhibit good behavior. Nothing encourages a child more than sincere praise, not flattery, but honest compliments when they do well. Yeah, we still need to correct the wrong, but we also need to commend the right. Now, I've done a lot of thinking over these next couple of points, and I'm going to give them to you because when I was alone in my office and I was thinking, what is it that I should give on this Father's Day? I have a whole lot of different messages, but I wanted to give some things from my heart that has helped me, and some things that I think would be an encouragement to you as a father. But I want to tell you this story, and then I'll give you the principles. So I want you to listen to me. Again, Paul warned us that we can parent our children in such a way that we can make them angry and bitter. We can make them, by our parenting, to become so angry that they lose respect for us. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, we find a tragic story of a son who became so angry at his father that he actually wanted to kill him. And I think it's one of the saddest stories in the Bible. David was a great king over the nation of Israel. But I'm telling you the truth, he was a lousy father, a lousy one. He was terrible. He could rule a country, but he could not control or rule his family. King David, even though he loved the Lord and served him, you know his problem. He had a problem with women. Like the culture of that day, they had many wives, and so David had multiple wives. God didn't like it, never did, caused a lot of problems, and because of that, David had a lot of children. I think over 60-some children. From one of his wives, he had a son by the name of Amnon. And from another of his wives, he had a daughter by the name of Tamar. Now, I want you to listen to me. The Bible tells us that Tamar was a very beautiful young woman. And the Bible says that her half-brother Amnon really loved her. He fell head and heels in love with her. And anyway, it says in that chapter that he was literally sick with lust and desire for her. I won't take the time to tell the entire story, but Amnon ends up attacking and raping Tamar. He forces her. It was a terrible thing that Amnon did. Tamar's life was completely ruined. No one would ever want to marry her now. They wouldn't. Absalom, David's other son, was furious when Tamar told him what Amnon had done to her. And it says that Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister. Now, when David found out what Amnon had did, listen to me. It says that David got angry, as well as he should have, right? He got angry over his son raping his daughter. But David, that's all, he didn't do anything. He didn't even correct Amnon. He didn't punish him. He didn't do anything. He didn't even address the issue. So after 2 full years, Absalom, his other son, decides to take matters into his own hands and takes his revenge out on Amnon for raping Tamar, his sister, by killing him. Absalom is so full of rage, he murders his own brother. Knowing he has murdered his own brother, Absalom flees to a place called Geshur. And for 3 years, he remains there. At the end of 3 years, now listen to me, David tells his servant Joab to go and find Absalom and bring him back. Go get him. And then one of the saddest verses in the Bible. Now remember, I'm telling you the story, then I'm giving you the principles. So Joab goes to Geshur and brings him, Absalom, back to Jerusalem. And the saddest verse in the Bible, and the king said, "Let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house and saw not the king's face. How long has he been gone? 1, 2, how many? 3, good. For another 2 years, David refuses to see Absalom. He's living in Jerusalem. In that chapter it says that Absalom marries and has 3 sons and 1 daughter. Guess what he names his daughter? Tamar. Bible says she was beautiful. Yet David never once picks up the phone to talk with Absalom. Never darkens his door. David never goes out of his way to see him. Then in verse 29, Absalom, after 3 years, it's been 5 years since he's seen his daddy. Now I know that he's done a terrible thing. He murdered his son, and I know that. But look at this. For another 2 years, David refuses to see him. At the end of 5 years now, Absalom's begging to see his daddy. I want to see my father. Joab tells him, okay. And so twice Absalom begs David to come and see him. Therefore Absalom sent for Joab, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not what? Absalom is so angry inside. His father refuses to see him. He tells Joab, it would have been better for me to remain back in Geshur than to come back to Jerusalem. My father will have nothing to do with me because of what I have done. And right there, Absalom grows within his heart in such rebellion. And the next few chapters tell a story of rebellion that you won't believe. Absalom's hatred was turned towards David. It became so strong that he tried to overthrow David from his throne so that he would become king. David had to flee for his life, or his own son would have killed him. That's a terrible thing. He forces David from off the throne. David has to run for his life, and then you won't believe this. In utter contempt and disrespect for his father, you won't believe what Absalom does. And I'm telling you, our kids, when they get angry, they will rebel. And the ideals and the values that they have, they will go in the exact opposite direction because they are so angry and bitter because of the rules and different things that you have forced upon them, not out of love, but out of force and criticism and verbal and physical abuse. They become angry. And with utter contempt, David is away from Jerusalem. Absalom goes up into the house of David, into the palace, up on the rooftop, and gets a tent. And in full sight of all of Israel, so everybody can see, Absalom has sex with all of David's wives out of anger and bitterness. I'll show him. I'll have no respect for him. He's a hypocrite. What disrespect. Absalom is in full-blown rebellion against his father. Oh, listen to me. Here's the principles. There's several of them. We can provoke our children to anger by harboring unforgiveness and bitterness towards them. Yes, what Absalom did was a terrible thing. He killed Amnon. Yes, I understand that. But continuing to harbor unforgiveness and bitterness towards him produces anger for our children. 3 years he fled. 3 years, and then 2 years. During this time, while he's there in Jerusalem, while he begs to see his dad, he plots. He hated him because his dad never resolved anything. May I say this? We can provoke our children to anger and rebellion by our lack of involvement in their lives. Please, I want to talk with you. I want to spend time with you. As I said, he had grandchildren he never saw. He was completely detached from his son. James Dobson cited a study showing that fathers of children on the average spend 37.7 seconds per day in real contact with their children. Children watch television approximately 54 hours per week. The average teen in our churches spend only 2 minutes a day in meaningful dialogue with their dads. 25% of those teens say that they never had a meaningful conversation with their father, something that the children need. A group of 300 7th and 8th graders kept accurate records of how much time their fathers actually spent time with them over a 2-week period. The average time for an entire week was 7.5 minutes. We need, as fathers, to get back in the picture. I know what David, our children are going to make mistakes. They're going to make mistakes. But we can't harbor bitterness and anger towards them for what they have done. We've got to come to a place, we have got to come to a place. That's why David didn't want to see him. He couldn't get over the fact of what he had done. But again, you'll see in the next principle that David literally caused a lot of the problem here. But we need to get back in the picture. I read about a little girl who drew a pretty picture. She went into her dad's office, crawled on his lap and said, "Daddy, come and see my picture." And the dad said, "Not now, honey. Daddy's busy." About 10 minutes later, she came back again, crawled on his lap and said, "Daddy, will you come see my picture?" The dad got frustrated. He said, "Can't you see I'm busy? Don't bother me right now. I'll come and look at your picture later when I'm ready." A couple of hours later, the dad came out and he said to his daughter, "Can I see the picture now?" And the girl said, "Sure." And it was a picture of her and her brother and her mom standing on the lawn with the family dog, with big smiles on a sunny day. But the dad noticed that he wasn't in the picture. And so the dad said, "That's a nice picture, sweetheart, but how come I'm not in the picture?" And the girl said, "Because you're working in your office, Daddy." The dad was crushed, but it dawned on him that he wasn't even in the picture of his daughter's life. Our kids are starving. Our children, we can provoke our children to anger by our failure to instruct and discipline them. When Amnon attacked his sister, David should have dealt with the problem. Instead, he did nothing. If he would have done something, do you think Absalom would have done what he did? Possibly no. But Absalom waited 2 whole years, his hatred growing towards his father and his brother. And so then he killed him. And then he fled for his life after he killed him, knowing that David would be enraged and would punish him. But David never did. David again passively stood by and did nothing. That verse that we started out with, "And you fathers, provoke not your children to anger, but" what? "Bring them up in the nurture" and what? Admonition. What is that word admonition? It means instruction of the Lord. He says, bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. He says, nourish your children. Bring them up in 2 things: the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Our kids need to be instructed. They need to know the ways of God. How are they going to learn about that? Do you think they're going to get everything they need from this pulpit on Sunday morning? They're not going to get everything they need. They need time with you. And this is the big one. We can provoke our children to anger when we live with hypocrisy instead of authenticity. You know why I think that David didn't do anything when Amnon raped his sister Tamar? Anybody would take a guess why? because David was immoral himself. If he'd have gone to Amnon and said, you ought not, what'd you do with Bathsheba? Or this or that. You got 60 some wives. But he lived with hypocrisy instead of authenticity. David gave his children all they needed except an example that they could follow. We need to live before our children in such a way that we can say not only do what I say, but do what I do. Some of you kids live in a home where there's so much profanity going back and forth, but you say it, you'll get a slap in the mouth. Listen to this. When we hold ourselves to one standard, but hold them to another standard, when we allow this, listen to this, our children will see that we have no firm standard, and they will come to believe that the Christian faith only calls for change in the eyes of other people, not in the eyes of God. God says we are to discipline and instruct our children by explanation and demonstration, by explaining with words and demonstrating with God's principles in our lives. Do you know why most PKs go bad? Now I'm speaking from preachers. You want to know why? There's two reasons. Well, there's probably a lot of reasons why. Because there's no authenticity inside of the home from what is preached behind the pulpit. Or the rules so that you will think that the kids are in perfect alignment with what you teach. You scream and yell. A preacher will scream and yell at their kids to walk uprightly so there's no bad reflection on the pastor. You know what? I let my kid be a kid. He is who he is. And I get phone calls. Up on the roof of the church. What are you doing up there, Jared? Riding his motorcycle out on the ball field. Did you know what your son's doing? Yeah, I guess I taught him when he was 4 in the church foyer to first ride his bike. You did what? He's a normal kid. I love him and I do correct him. I want him to know that I try my best to live with authenticity inside the home. I try my best. I still have no promises that he'll turn out. I hope he does, but I refuse to live with hypocrisy. You see what you get here behind the pulpit. I am who I am. I'm not perfect. No amens. Thank you for that. All right. Paul said this, and every father, look at me, every single father should be able to say what the Apostle Paul said. Be ye imitators or followers of me. I want you to follow me, even as I also follow Christ. Can you say that, Dad? Can you say that? Can you say that? Our children need to see authenticity of faith in their father's life. Many years ago, a farmer and his family, after a hard year of farm work, were rewarded with a wonderful fine crop of grain. There was going to be some happy days, and just a few days before the harvest came, a terrible windstorm and hailstorm came, and the entire crop was destroyed. After the storm was over, the father, that farmer, with his wife and his little boy at his side, went out to the back porch to view the field and all the damage. It was wiped out. The little boy tearfully realized the crop was gone, looked up at his dad, expecting to hear words of despair, frustration, and anger. And all at once, his father started to sing softly, "Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." Years later, that little boy, now grown, said, "That was the greatest sermon I have ever heard." When he lost his grain crop because of his faith in that one trial, he forever gained me to follow after him. That son saw the faith of a godly man. And I want my son just to know this. I'm renewing my vows before God as a father. I want God to say this about each of us this morning. And if you're a father here, I'm going to ask you to cry out to God and ask this to be true of you. Genesis 18:19. Abraham was in his tent, and the Lord came to visit him with some angels. And God was getting ready to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord and the angels were talking, and should we tell him what we're going to do? Yeah, I'm going to tell him what we're going to do. We're going to tell him that we're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And then God said this. I cannot believe this verse. This is what I'm begging every single father, grandfather, whatever influence you have. This is the prayer. And the Lord said this to Abraham, about Abraham to the angels. I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the what? The Lord, to do justice and judgment. That's a pretty powerful prayer to pray. For I know him. For I know him. It has been said a child is not likely to find a father in God unless he finds something of God in his father. Would you stand with me, please, this morning? His life really could not have been going any better. And then the phone rang. This father was an evangelist who preached the word with power. He was one of the most sought after evangelists in his denomination. If you wanted him to come and preach in your church, you had to get in line and wait a minimum of 4 years to hear this preacher, this father. He was a man who enjoyed the favor of God upon his life and his ministry. There was a lot of invitations that always pulled him away from his family. But he and his wife had a formula that they had worked on that enabled him to spend time at home, not as much as he liked, with his son that he loved. The formula was simple. He would go out and preach for 2 weeks, and then he would come back home for 2 weeks. Then he would go back out again for 2 weeks and back home for another 2 weeks. Everything was working and God was blessing. His marriage was strong. His boy, now a teenager, was doing well in school and athletics. And his ministry, again, was taking off like a rocket. And then the phone rang. It was a short phone call from his wife. She had just had the latest in a series of arguments with their 16-year-old son. She had asked him to do something, and he told his mom point blank that he wasn't going to do it. He was 6 foot tall. 6'2". And he wasn't going to do it. He was wearing her down. His strong will was starting to take the toll on his mother. So she called her evangelist husband and in a short conversation told him what was happening. And then she simply said, I need